So we need to look at all those things. And then, as I said, the balance between the states and the international organization. And while we are united in contagion, it is not necessarily the case that the balance of interests and values is the same from one country to another. The assaults on our civil liberties and human rights and individual agency in looking after my own health, that question will be answered differently depending on the political values of different societies in different countries. And the idea that we should hand over powers on this and give coercive powers of compulsion to an unelected, unaccountable international technocracy or bureaucracy requires much more of a fundamental debate openly. And here we are rushing to adopt a treaty with barely any public debate. I just find that astonishing.
And then, I mean, related. So, hi everyone. I'm very, very pleased to welcome today Professor Thakur, a very senior expert from the United Nations system and actually Assistant Secretary General, and was also a senior advisor to Kofi Annan, if I've got that right, as well as being Vice Rector of the United Nations University.
Correct.
And currently now you're...
That was in the past.
That was in the past, yeah. And a very, very extensive academic career in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, author of 50 books and 400 articles, and currently professor at the Centre for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament at the Crawford School of the Australian National University.
Even that is now in the past. I'm emeritus professor, fully retired.
Oh, fully retired, okay.
I can say what I like.
Okay, well, that's good.
Not that it stopped me before, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, the reason we reached out today is because the pandemic preparedness treaty process is ongoing around the World Health Organization, and I guess it's going to lead up, in theory, to a vote in 2024. And just wanted to get some sort of big picture thoughts on to what extent can you centralize these health policy questions at the WHO level, and to what extent should this be left to member states to decide their own domestic national health policies? And I know you've already commented on COVID response, so I know you know the issue quite well.
Well, this is actually much closer to my main preoccupation, or what used to be my day job, in terms of global governance issues. So I thought we could structure this conversation around three main themes, if you like. One is the logic behind the efforts to do that, which does take us back to global governance, why we need something like that, or why people believe we need something like that. The second is the details of the proposals. And in particular, I think you have some very nice slides pointing out the differences between the two instruments that are one is being amended, which already exists, and the second one as a new treaty, the International Health Regulations and a new International Pandemic Treaty. And then the third question as to, is this justified? Is this the best we can do? Or should we resist it? Does that make sense?
That's perfect, yeah.
Okay.
So should we start with the logic then?
Yeah, sure. The logic is quite simple. Increasingly now, the major problems, the big pressing problems we face in the world, inside states, nonetheless tend to have their sources globally, and solutions that are required have to be global in scope, and therefore multilateral solutions. What Kofi Annan in my time in the UN used to call problems without passports requires solutions without passports. Now, I want to come back to that later on, because one of the problems with what we've done with COVID is that for problems without passports, we've actually introduced passports, not just internationally, but domestically, and for accessing all sorts of daily activities like going to the theater or going to sporting stadiums. Or if you want to put the argument in very stark terms, COVID confirms that the world is united in contagion. We can't hide behind borders because the borders are impermeable. And the question it throws up is, can the world be united by contagion? In other words, can we come up with a response that confirms that we are indeed one world? So the global governance of health is a big issue, ranging from statistical gathering to codes of conduct, from all sorts of issues, including breastfeeding, to finding ways around patent rights so that poor countries can have affordable access to the best medicines going for the diseases that affect them as well. And this is important because what we've seen, particularly with COVID, is the rapidity with which major problems arise and circle the globe very quickly, taking advantage of the sinews of globalization. So we can have the emergence of new, deadly, and highly contagious diseases, acting against the reality of the lack of border defenses to protect against them, the greater vulnerability of poor countries and poor people, owing to non-existent preventive and negligible therapeutic care, all of which are part of, if you like, the dark sides of globalization. Meaning we have back and forth movement of people. It's already fading in memory, but if you go back to pre-2020, the flow of people back and forth in large numbers as business travelers, tourists, international technocrats, traders, soldiers, migrants, internally displaced people, refugees, etc. Then the modes of transport that they were using. The reality that the incubation periods, which ensure that most outbreaks develop symptoms only after borders have already been crossed. It's not that everything is asymptomatic, but the incubation period takes you through an asymptomatic period, and it's hard to detect, impossible to detect them at the border. And then, of course, we've seen the jumps across plant, bird, animal species of some diseases, all of which adds up very quickly to a deadly cocktail of exotic diseases that cross borders free of passport and visa regulations. And they've shown the need to update. I'm not sure that the international health regulation that we're going to talk about later, they actually have their origins going back to 1903 in something called the International Sanitary Regulations, which came about after protracted negotiations and were finally codified in the health regulations, adopted in '69 and then revised substantially in 2005. So we have this reality of diseases that can emerge anywhere, spread very quickly as COVID did, traveling through these things, insinuating itself, the pathogen insinuates itself into the interstices of global commerce and global tourist traffic and other human traffic, and also container traffic, if you like. And by the time we realize it's broken out, it's too late. So we need some international system to detect, to identify, to provide technical advice on what to do, by whom, to ensure that medicines have an unbroken global supply chain so that they can be transported and moved from where they are being produced and manufactured to where they are most urgently needed at affordable prices. In other words, break down the barriers to mitigation and response and containment. And that has not been an efficient and effective architecture of global health governance. And I think the pandemic brought that about very clearly. And the reason I said that this takes me back to my day job when I was working is this is something we worked on very strongly in the UN system. And our responsibility in the United Nations University was to help prepare the UN intellectually for emergencies across the board. And this was one of the major ones that we identified. In fact, one of the exercises I was involved in was behind the scenes the move to create a new G20, a leaders level meeting, which we did succeed. And some of the crises we identified that might act as triggers to such a meeting. One was financial crisis, which actually did happen. A second was pandemic. A third was a major terrorist incident. A fourth was a major nuclear weapon incident. So it's not that these were unpredictable or unknown. We couldn't predict when, where, the severity and magnitude, the origins of it, nor could we predict which would come first and the sequence of them. But the pandemic was always on the card, and we were not very well prepared for it. So all these demonstrate very clearly the need for an efficient and equitable international architecture of global health governance. That's where the need comes in.
Yeah, I guess one thing we could look at is maybe that I think there's a difference between the surveillance side and the testing and actually the policy response. I think that could be a big question for most people, that certainly everybody understands the need for surveillance globally, but it's when it comes to policy response in country, because it's so dependent on the characteristics of any particular country. You know, to what extent should they be trying to globalize those policy responses once you have the pandemic?
Well, there's lots of things in there. I think once you get away from a certain level of abstraction in the discussion, the fundamental problem, going back to what I was saying earlier, can be rephrased as this. The major problems affecting us are mostly global in scope, and as I said, require global solutions through multilateral channels. But the policy authority for addressing the challenges is still vested in sovereign states, and only states can mobilize coercively the resources needed to tackle them. So what is the appropriate balance between state level responses and the global architecture? How much are countries prepared to cede policymaking authority and coercive monitoring, surveillance, testing, and enforcement compliance powers to an international machinery? How can we assure that this international machinery is truly impartial, technically competent, and effective and efficient in delivering its mandate? And does the WHO meet these benchmarks? Well, certainly going by its COVID response, the answer is unfortunately a very clear and emphatic no. That has not always been the case. Why does the WHO have such a high reputation? Because it actually has a very good history. It was set up in 1948. You've got the slides that you will put up later, showing, you know, it has field offices in about 150 countries, professional staff of around 8,000, biennial budget of about $8 billion. But already in the budgetary contributions, you have two things that are worth noting. One is the very uneven spread of contributions. The major contributors, I think in order at the moment, are Germany, the Gates Foundation, United States, European Commission, UK. China is often talked about as controlling the WHO, to the point where a former Japanese deputy prime minister, Taro, actually referred to it as the Chinese Health Organization, CHO, rather than WHO. But in fact, China's contribution is less than 1% of the budget. Where China comes in is through the World Health Assembly, which is the governing council for the WHO. And that is member states, and China has very good and close relations with a lot of member states. So there's that aspect to it. Now, in its original priorities, tackling malaria, tackling TB, looking at other infectious diseases, providing technical help as well as financial assistance to the various developing countries. Successes in, you know, I think it cut back polio by about 99%. A lot of these were successful. It eliminated river diseases, I forget the technical name for that, in Western Africa. But the biggest pride, I think, in the WHO system, and indeed in the UN system, about WHO past, was the complete eradication of smallpox, a 12-year effort from 67 to 79. And that's when WHO worked pretty close to the ideals in which it is meant to work. It was not so good. It was reasonably good in SARS in 2000, 2002, I think. Not so good maybe in Ebola. And even with the swine flu, I think there were some scandals associated with the ordering of Tamiflu and excess amounts and allegations of corruption or too close a link between the WHO professional people or consultants and the pharmaceutical industry. So the technical background and successes and accomplishments gave it a certain reputation. But the second thing that has happened in more recent times, and that's across the board a pathology that affects the entire UN system, is the balance between contributions to the core budget, which are assessed on a formula based on what countries can pay in terms of their various income levels. The balance between that and what we used to call extra budgetary support, which is directed funding, discretionary funding, that has shifted. Initially, core budget would be 80% assessed contribution. Now it's the voluntary contributions that are 80%. And that means effectively the WHO, like other parts of the specialized entities in the UN system, has become much more captive to the interests of the big donors and the most powerful countries, particularly when it comes to enforcing its standards. So it's the only body we have to promulgate international health standards and norms. And it was the first to provide, for example, a register of crucial diseases, infectious diseases. But that sense that it has been captured by certain groups has grown. And so there is less happiness with that. And then, as I said, you get into this business of how it responded to COVID, which we can come back to later. So you can see why legitimacy and faith and confidence in the WHO is a legacy and carry over, but it may not be as justified today when you look back at the way it handled. So there's those issues.
Yeah, I'm also wondering, as you were saying that one of the questions is that the process so far in this pandemic preparedness treaty actually seems to be making permanent some of those mistakes that were made in the COVID response. You said, I've heard it quite a few times, that there was a break in credibility around sort of 2017 or so. It started going down a little bit maybe, and got worse during COVID. But the process so far looks to be cementing a lot of those things that went wrong and making them sort of semi-permanent. That's my impression.
I think that's correct. I think the timing is wrong. I think the timing and the sequence is wrong. We first need to come out of this pandemic, and then we need to have serious, rigorous reviews of the performance of countries and the international system. Identify mistakes that were made, and then create a new structure that helps us to avoid those mistakes instead of institutionalizing them and embedding them in a new regime. And because pretty much most governments, certainly the most consequential governments, went down this path, and the WHO went down this path, they have a vested interest in locking in that narrative that what we did was necessary, was based in solid science, and has proven hugely beneficial and effective. Every one of these is questionable.
Yeah.
In fact, the measures we took violated the most authoritative document that was in existence, which was from the WHO, published in October 2019, which summarized a century's worth of accumulated science and experience, and explicitly rejected a lot of these measures. And they've been proven right in their skepticism of these measures, that all you do is buy time. If you want to do these for buying time, so if you want the 2 or 3 weeks to flatten the curve and ramp up your health system, that's fine. What you do then is make the curve gradual rather than steep up and down, and you spread it out. But you don't avoid it. And we're seeing that today in Australia and New Zealand, where our curves for infections and mortality on a proportional basis, so dying per million people with COVID, even without getting into the width and off distinction. Our statistics in Australia and New Zealand at the moment are horrific. And I've just looked at that recently, and we are well above world averages, Asian averages, African averages, North American averages, European averages. So this notion that we succeeded is wrong. We just pushed it back, and then you get the after effects. So it violated those, and yet it's the 2019 report that actually stands better today than what we've done in the past little while with respect to lockdowns, with respect to masking, even vaccines.
Yeah.
I think we've seen by now, it seems to me that the actual evidence, the empirical data is overwhelmingly clear. And that's two things. We have deliberately downplayed the accumulating list of harms and the adverse events that are being reported exceed by orders of magnitude because the lockdowns have prevented the buildup of natural immunity against these diseases. So I think we have a long way to go before we can state with any confidence what the balance of harms and things is. So that was one thing it ignored. The second thing it ignored, I think, if you go back to its own constitution, which not many people do, which defines health holistically, not simply as the absence of a disease or infirmity, but as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And then if you look at that, again, the harms, particularly on a worldwide basis, are enormous, and they'll be around for a long time. Look at the damage to kids' education and the associated health impacts of that, the damage to mental health, the damage to deferred immunization programs throughout the third world, developing countries, which has been a huge setback. The skepticism that will grow about vaccines in general from this experience, that's going to affect your vaccine take-up in other fronts, which would be a great pity, because most vaccines have actually been enormously beneficial. The deliberate and very ill-conceived attempt to conflate opposition to COVID vaccine mandates with anti-vaxxing vaccine sentiment, I think that's going to be counterproductive enormously in the long run. The impact on food production and distribution, which is going to kill people in the tens of millions over the next decade or two. Where is the balance of assessment of these long-term collateral harms and benefits? And I'd be extremely surprised if more people are not killed by the various measures that were taken over the next 2 decades than was saved by these measures. So I think the benefits of these measures are harder to demonstrate. The harms are already becoming clear and will become even starker when we look at the whole world as we go forward. So I think we need all those lessons before we move to reforming the existing architecture, whether it is through amendments of the existing health regulations or whether it's in the form of new treaty. And again, that's important. So we are not, at least I am not rejecting in principle the need for a new architecture. But I question very strongly the direction of the existing proposed amendments by the Americans and the existing proposed new treaty. I don't think we need to rush into that. Let's take our time, let's get it right, and let's make sure that we don't hand over powers to an international bureaucracy that is far from impartial. At least I don't have confidence that it will be impartial. I don't have confidence in how technically competent it will be. And it will reflect the interests of big pharma and big donors And we need to look at that relationship as well. And it will lock in the narratives, because these people are the ones who took us down this road. They don't want to reopen those. And you look at the record of the WHO in its initial investigation into the origins of the coronavirus, and that was just disgraceful. You look at the way they exclude Taiwan from participation, even as an observer in the World Health Assembly, at the behest of China.
Yeah.
I mean, let's get real. Taiwan
Yeah.
was one of the most effective and prompt state responders when COVID first broke out. It only lies 130 kilometers off the mainland. You have over 1 million Taiwanese resident in the mainland. You have 4 or 5 million travelers going back and forth between the two. This crisis occurred at a time of a Chinese New Year festival, and families travel back and forth for family reunions. Despite all that, Taiwan acted, let's not forget, against the WHO advice at the time, which rejected this as a human-to-human transmission. The Taiwanese said, no, that's not clear, we're not going to take that risk. So it has a lot to offer in terms of its technical performance, in terms of its democratic credentials, in terms of its ability to offer best practice lessons, and we reject that. So until we take care of these big underlying questions, I would be very reluctant to empower yet another bureaucracy, which also, by the way, will then acquire a vested interest in declaring pandemics every so often, because its defining purpose, its existence, its powers, its budgets will all depend upon more and more pandemics. The more, the better. And yet, historically, before COVID, I think we've only had 4 pandemics in the 100 years before this. The Spanish flu, 2018-19, the Asian flu, 57-58, the Hong Kong flus around 67, and the avian flu around 2009. So in all these years, it's a rare event. It's high impact when it does happen. But in the context of the overall diseases that affect people all the time, it's a low disease burden from pandemics rather than a high one. And even, I mean, I've looked at the statistics since 1st March 2020 through to the end of May 2022. In this period, the total numbers of COVID deaths we are looking at, COVID-related deaths, is just over 6 million, 6.3 million or something. That's below the number of deaths from heart diseases, cancers, strokes, lung diseases, flu and pneumonia. So why should pandemics override everything else?
Yeah, by a factor of maybe 8 or 9 in some of those diseases. So
we need to look at all those things. And then, as I said, the balance between the states and the international organization. And while we are united in contagion, it is not necessarily the case that the balance of interests and values is the same from one country to another. The assaults on our civil liberties and human rights and individual agency in looking after my own health, that question will be answered differently depending on the political values of different societies in different countries. And the idea that we should hand over powers on this and give coercive powers of compulsion to an unelected, unaccountable international technocracy or bureaucracy requires much more of a fundamental debate openly. And here we are rushing to adopt a treaty with barely any public debate. I just find that astonishing.
And then, I mean, related to that, I guess, is it sounds like we have a similar interpretation of where this process is going, but it does seem to be dominated by insiders. So I'm thinking about the independent panel. I looked at the CVs of the independent panel, and 9 of the 13, nine of the 13 on the panel are in one way or another related to the UN. And as you said, you know, there is that then sort of bureaucratic imperative, bigger budget, more pandemics, more money flowing in.
How many results of that incestuous composition with the initial investigation?
Yeah, exactly.
There were too many people with conflicts of interest who shouldn't have been there.
Yeah, yeah. And how, I mean, how many people sort of, how do people sort of raise those issues? Because as I said, I'm
Well,
sort of worried that it's like a train on the tracks that's just on its own journey. How do you get a democratic
I
involvement in
think,
that?
I mean, this is where I react both as an ex-UN Assistant Secretary General, as you said, but also as an academic. I think domestically, we have seen not a corruption of our democratic legitimacy, but certainly an erosion of our democratic credentials and legitimacy in the Western world by the rise of what's been called the administrative state, which is the empowerment of technocrats, bureaucrats, experts who tell us what to do. And you see an example of this in the reaction from Dr. Anthony Fauci to a Supreme Court verdict invalidating certain mandates for uh, workforce in terms of vaccines, when he said this is something that should be left to the health bureaucracy. What is the court doing in that? In other words, the rule of law should not apply to the bureaucrats. You get that same attitude internationally, except internationally you don't have the corresponding checks and balances through elected representatives and through judicial mechanisms either. So there is that aspect. So effectively, what they're arguing for is the creation of the equivalent of the administrative state at the national level, at the international level, but without the accountability, without the electoral mechanisms, without political mass. And at the national level, we saw, in the name of following the science, an abdication of political responsibility by ministers. Pretty much everywhere, certainly in Australia, and as far as I can tell, in the UK and most European countries as well, they forgot that we have ministers of health, not ministers for COVID.
Yeah.
And ministers of health operate in a cabinet system where there are other considerations to bear in mind also. How much do we allocate attention and resources to one issue as opposed to trying to find a balance between different issues? Governments are multi-purpose organizations, not single purpose. So why would we hand over power to one part even of the international bureaucracy to intrude deep into domestic affairs and have the power to order mass house arrest of healthy people? We've never done this before in history. It has not been a happy experience, and it has been counterproductive and a self-defeating experience. It didn't achieve the goals. It caused a lot of damage, and I don't think we should go down that path at all. So I think they need to go back to the 2019 report, revised slightly in light of what's the experiences since then, and reissue that on a much firmer footing instead of creating a vast new system. I think, and this is where you need to get into the technical differences between the international health regulations and the new treaty as well. The advantage of the route that the Americans wanted to go down was that you can adopt amendments to existing health regulations by a simple majority and bring into force quite rapidly. A new treaty, on the other hand, will need approval by a two-thirds majority, and then will need ratification in national systems. And certainly you can never take ratification of any new treaty in the United States for granted in the Senate, especially as if at the end of this year, the composition of the Senate changes quite significantly in terms of the two parties. And nor will it be taken for granted elsewhere. And I think clearly some countries, if I remember the Brazilians, for example, at the last World Health Assembly meeting last month, made it clear that if they were going to rush through, then they would pull out, that then we needed more time. So I think there is that aspect as well. We need to have a lot more open, transparent debate where what is being proposed is discussed, the rationale and justification for that is publicly debated amongst people who are contrarians and skeptics, as well as people who are advocates for it, proponents for it. Let's have them open to it. I think you get much better buy-in. You know, one of the messy systems of democracy is that it delays decision-making. But the advantage is that at the end of that, you do have much broader buy-in. And yes, of course, you can have much more efficient decision-making in a China compared to the volatility and shambolic decision-making process in India. But at the end of the day, the people of India do feel they own that decision.
Yeah.
It is a genuinely stakeholder society, even amidst widespread poverty. The advantages are much more marked for us in the high-income countries in the Western democracies. So let's have the debate. If the policy process of open debate and democratic decision-making produces better policy outcomes as well. There's not just an intrinsic value statement. It's also an outcome-driven justification for the process. You have better policy process, you have better outcome at the end of that, and you have much broader and informed consent from the general population. This is why we did it. This is as far as we are prepared to go. And if this is the need, we'll support it. But you have to explain it to them. You have to carry the people. You can't impose it on them, because that produces resentment and, in due course, resistance. That doesn't work to anyone's advantage.
Mm-hmm. Good. I think that's a very good summary of where we are with this process, and I suspect there will be some resistance going forward over the next couple of years as to how this process develops, unless it's opened up and more diverse opinions are allowed to be aired. Exactly. Good. All right. Thank you very much. I think that's
it's a rare case or rare example of where the developing countries saved us in the West.
I think this may be the way forward on this. I think they're much less inclined to give up sovereignty and decision making, and that could be the end result of this, that it needs to be done.
Yeah, I think we are more inclined, we as governments are more inclined to give up, because in fact we are gaining sovereignty over the others.
Yes.
We control the process. We are confident that we can control the outcomes.
Yeah.
You know, it's when the International Criminal Court turns its attention to possible war crimes with the Americans, suddenly the American government says, hang on, you do that, we're going to put sanctions on you. We're going to arrest you if you come to the United States. We'll freeze your assets if you do that to us. This is something that should be used against others, not against us.
Yeah.
Well, the balance of international influence and power, even in the UN system, is changing. And I think we need to be careful of that, because what we have from the powerful countries of the global south, symbolized in the BRICS, but not just limited to them. So the China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, and now some others joining as well, is a recognition that the existing system of global governance reflects the dominance of the values and interests and money of the West. We would like to redesign the institutions now so that the controls for the system no longer run only through Western capitals, and some of them come through our capitals. That's not going to be a comfortable position for Western governments or Western publics. But if we are going to go down that route, we need to have a rebalancing that is as much a moral, values-based rebalancing as a strategic and financial rebalancing. And so until we have that conversation, the international system is going to remain broken.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. Well, let's keep an eye on this process and maybe circle back in a few months, seeing as it develops.